Hello, everyone. We did it. Yay.
I have plenty more of these, so if people want another one for folks who didn't make it or somebody at home, just let me know. We'll take care of it. All right. So, good morning, one and all. I'm not used to a microphone that works. This is really good. Yeah, we've got time, right? All right. So, what I thought I would talk about today is something I think we've talked about in the past, and we'll talk about it again, the history of the Office of the Sheriff. It's a very old institution, I think a lot older than many people realize. So whenever I travel around, I'm always curious to find out how things are done locally. And as was mentioned before, Tim Cruz, the DA, has now been elected by his colleagues to be the president of the National District Attorneys Association. So I think he'll be very busy, but I think we're all very proud of him to represent. Here we are, little Plymouth County, Massachusetts, and our DA is the head of the guys nationally. So it's going to require him to do a lot of travel, but I'm going to remind everybody, whenever anything big legally is going on, like at the White House or in Congress or things like that, and they have that, you know what that scene looks like. We call it Mount Rushmore, when you get like the president is signing something and all those people in the background. Always take a look now, because I'm going to bet you money somewhere in that crowd, Tim Cruz will be standing. So, yeah, it'll be fun. And then we can all look at each other and say, I know that guy. How fun is that, right? So, I made up some sheets here, and I'll give them to people if they want them. They're little history sheets. There was one that I did. I called it The History of the Office of the Sheriff. And I wrote that up, and then I must have forgotten that I wrote it, because then I did another one, which I called The Sheriff and the Deputy Sheriff. They're very similar, but they're a little bit different. And then I have another one, which is The Sheriff and the Magna Carta, which is interesting. Now, the question that I'm asked, and I teach a similar class in our Corrections Academy, and the reason that I do it is I don't want necessarily to stress the recruits out or anything like that. What I want them to understand is the history of the office and where they fit into that history, and to build an esprit de corps, a spirit of teamwork, and a pride in what it is that we do. And I know I want to give a special shout out to the chief and our colleagues here at Halifax PD. They do a great job. We're privileged to work with those guys. And I will say, and I mean this with all sincerity, Massachusetts has 14 sheriffs. We have 14 counties and 14 sheriffs. But nowhere is there a better relationship between our local law enforcement, our local police departments, and the sheriff's office than here in Plymouth County. And the reason that I say that is it's a personal thing. We get together at least once a month. We talk about issues. We all experience problems and challenges, and we work them out together. I've always said the best ideas don't always come from me. And that's true. My wife says the best ideas never come from me, but that's another story. But the sheriffs are the same way, and it's very interesting. There are 14 counties in Massachusetts, as I said, and there are 14 sheriffs. Now, there are 14 counties, but there is only 11 DAs. So we've got 14 sheriffs and 11 DAs, and it's funny, the DA will always remind me, he says, there's fewer of us than there are of you. He says, and that makes me just a little bit more special than you. Okay, I'll go along with that. But the reason that there's only 11 DAs is what they have done is something that I think they're trying to do or have been trying to do with the sheriffs for many years now. They've combined counties. So if you ever see stuff that's happening down on Cape Cod or the islands, they always talk about the Cape and Islands DA. It's not a Barnstable County DA, it's Cape and Islands. So they've combined those. And if you go out into the far reaches of the realm, out in the western frontier, in they've got what's called the Northwestern District. So they've combined several counties out there. So that would be like Franklin County. Some of those, out where North Adams is, and some of those. So you've got regional DAs. So that's why there's a difference in the number. Coming forward or coming east, something that people find not strange, but unusual in the sense that Martha's Vineyard is its own county. You know, it's an island, and it's 8 towns, something like that, 8 or 9 towns. They're their own county, so they are they're Dukes County. And as the old sheriff used to remind me, they go by the name of the county of Dukes County, which sounds kind of repetitive, but that's what they call themselves. And I guess if that's what they call themselves, that's what I'm going to call them. So they're their own county. And then if you go just a little further out to sea and a little bit south, you have that other island, Nantucket. Now, Nantucket is only one town, but Nantucket is its own county. So they've got their own sheriff. So you've got Nantucket County. They don't have a correctional facility on Nantucket, you can imagine. There is a correctional facility on Martha's Vineyard. How many people have ever been past it? I know no one's been in it, but how many people have been past it? You might have. Did you know what it was when you passed it? No, and that's not unusual, because I didn't know what it was when I passed it the first half a dozen times. And then I went down there to visit after I got elected sheriff. And then I realized, because it looks like any other of the beautiful houses down on Martha's Vineyard. It's got some stuff out back that you would recognize as institutional. But inside, it's very unusual, because it looks like a nice white home. And then inside, the cells that they have, which they don't use very often, but they're the granite cells with the iron bars, just like you saw in the movies. You know, we could film a movie there. But their capacity down there on Martha's Vineyard is only about 35 or so inmates. Their population right now is probably somewhere around a dozen. So they've got about 12 inmates. And it's unusual for me. The first time I went down there, the population was much higher, relatively speaking. But as I was walking around, it occurred to me, now at that time, we had about 1,700 inmates in our facility. Now we're running about 1,000, 1,100 routinely. But you can see there's a big difference in scale there. But it just struck me as odd as I walked through that facility with the sheriff, and he would grab different inmates as he was walking through, and he'd say, oh, Jimmy, I saw your mother at Stop and Shop, and she wanted me to make sure that you're taking your blood pressure medication. Oh yeah, Sheriff, I'm doing it. So it's different in scale, and it's different the way that it feels. But but the ideas are all the same, no matter how big or how small that correctional facility is. I do know they're going to be doing some renovations over there coming up, and I think when they do that, I've been asked, we'll probably take all of their inmates for that period of time. Now, Nantucket, they have no jail. They don't even really have a holding facility. The sheriff's office in Nantucket is actually the old police station that was outgrown by the police down there. So he's got some holding cells, but he really can't hold anybody for more than a few hours. So what the sheriff does down on Nantucket, and he's a wonderful guy, his name is Jim Perelman, he will take his people that are held, and he will take them himself on the ferry, and they ferry over to Barnstable County, so they are held at Barnstable County, where they have a much bigger capacity. So how many people have seen the inside or done a tour of our correctional facility? Yeah. Well, that's something we might want to do at some point in time as a group. I think that would be fun. It would be eye-opening. And as much as I hate to say it, if you've seen one correctional facility, at least in Massachusetts, you've seen them all. Because they're all, with the exception of Nantucket and the Vineyard, they're all pretty much the same. We operate on what's a system that's known as direct supervision. So whatever you have seen in the movies with, the old linear system, they used to call it, with the tiers of cells and, the corrections officers walking back and forth along those tiers, that's the old way. And if you ever had an opportunity to visit a place like MCI Walpole, that's how they used to have that set up. And that's very bad for many, many reasons, not the least of which is on the employees. You know, they used to say that if you had, as a corrections officer, if you had to walk from one end of a tier to the other, you did it up against the wall. Because if you walked out further, the inmates on the higher tiers could see you down there, and they would throw things down on you. Yeah, and you can imagine some of the things that they would throw, right? I won't talk about them, but you can imagine. So the new way, we call it direct supervision, and what it consists of, our correctional facility in Plymouth was built in the early 90s. It opened in 1994. And I do know, and occasionally I see people, before they put inmates and detainees in there, they did allow members of the public to come in and spend the night if they wanted to. It was an interesting concept. Yeah, that was back in, yeah. So, but there are folks around who tell me that they've done that. So what it consists of, if you've not seen it, and hopefully we can get a trip together and you guys can come over and see it, it's a large common area, okay, sort of like this, but even bigger in most of the units, surrounded by 2 levels of lockable cells. And if you were to walk inside, you'd see a large common area with tables, chairs, things that people can come out, and we do some programming in there, some training in there. Some training is done off or out of that unit. But what we've tried to do with this modern concept is, rather than move the inmates in and out of their cells, we bring things to those units. Because we found historically, you know, if the prison movies you've all seen, if someone's going to get shanked, or, you know, someone's going to get attacked, where does that happen, right? It happens in the chow hall or in the ball yard. It's so, and the movies portray it that way, and that's pretty much the way that it had historically been. So by minimizing the travel or the movement of those inmates in the correctional facility, we have minimized the incidents like that happening. And it's a very rare instance that it happens now. We also have people who work in our classification departments whose job it is. Now imagine this one. You're trying to plan, or you're running a hotel, let's say. I tell people that all the time. I'm in the hospitality business, right? But you have to be careful, because you need to know what the gang affiliations are of people. You need to know who their enemies are, what the charge is that they're, and you have to be conscious of all this and keep sort of a list going, because you can have situations where you have one bad guy from the city of Brockton who's being, or going potentially be housed in a unit with another bad guy from Brockton, and they're both from rival gangs. And that can cause problems, not just for them, but for us. You know, because people get injured, people, whatever. The other thing you have to remember is, a lot of these folks that, let's say they're in there for a homicide, all right? They're accused of a murder. They're either, well, they wouldn't be serving a sentence with us necessarily, although they can be. That's something we'll talk about. What can happen in those circumstances is, if you put the inmate who's accused of that homicide into the unit with relatives of the person he allegedly killed, can you see that that would cause us some problems? Yes. So we have to know who the enemies list is, not just gang affiliations, but the enemies list. And one of the things that our correctional officers are really very, very good at is identifying gang members by the tattoos that they, you know, when they're inside. On the outside, a lot of the gang members will, you know, they'll wear certain colors, certain professional sports teams they will wear, hats that way. And you know, the police are very adept at identifying those things. But when they come into us, they're all wearing uniforms, and they're usually color-coded based upon what their status is as an inmate or a pretrial detainee. But one thing that they do, and we are very conscious of this, is when they come in through booking, those questions are asked, you know, and we photograph all of their tattoos. That's a lot of times how the gang members delineate or differentiate themselves, other than clothing, is through tattoos. And those folks with a military background will know what I'm talking about when I mention a fruit salad. You know, when you see a military person, and where my badge is here, they would have that colorful square indicating different things. And if you are in the military, you'll have a knowledge of what each of those things denotes, what it means. You know, you'll have presidential unit citations, service in Iraq, service in Afghanistan, you know, wherever they happen to have served. and the medals and citations and awards that they've received. Well, let me tell you something. The gang tattoos are almost exactly the same. So one of the things that we do, and the guys that come in for their own safety, for the most part, they will tell us what their gang affiliation is. So when you ask them, do you have any gang affiliation? They usually are pretty forthcoming, yes. And what is that gang affiliation? So what we've done is, knowing what gangs they're affiliated with, we photograph all of their tattoos. We have experts on staff, and sometimes they are called upon in court to come in and testify as to what those tattoos mean. Because sometimes, how many people remember Aaron Hernandez, the Patriots player that was charged with murder, right? And a lot of people asked why it was he wasn't held with us, because all the high-profile federal inmates held by the marshal come to us. And there's a good reason for that. And it's got little to do with me. It has more to do with the staff. We're the best facility in the state, by far, in my opinion, with all due respect to my colleagues. But there's never any question. But Aaron Hernandez did not come to us. And the reason that he didn't is because that was a Bristol County case. So he was in Bristol County. But one of the things we did have was one of our corrections officers was on deck to testify as to what, and if you saw the photos of him, he was adorned with tattoos everywhere. And we had an expert on staff who could identify what those tattoos were, what gang they were affiliated, and what they actually meant. And according to him, I did speak, he's since retired, but before then, he was able to tell me that he could basically tell this guy's criminal history the same way that a judge would look at it in a courtroom and see the record. It was all written on his body. Yeah. So he was poised to testify. So that's interesting. And they tell us, and we keep a database of that, and that's something that's available to all of our law enforcement partners and is disseminated on a routine basis. The other interesting thing is, it's a very rare occasion that crimes that happen on the outside are not talked about on the inside. So we have a dedicated team at the sheriff's office. We call them IPS, IPS, the Inner Perimeter Security Team. I started it, but I can't take credit for it. It's an idea that I stole from the Department of Corrections. And what they do is they will gather intelligence inside the correctional facility to share with our colleagues in law enforcement and the local police departments about what's being said inside about who's committing what crimes on the outside. Because it's, as I said, it's a rare occasion that something bad happens out there that these guys aren't talking about it. The other thing that's very interesting is the phone system. And we had talked about that earlier. There's some controversy with the phone system now. Apparently, the phone calls, I shouldn't say apparently, because the legislature passed a law a few years ago that the use of the phones now for our inmates is now free, right? So that's great. They get to enjoy free phone calls just like everyone here, right? No. We have to pay. And now we have to pay for those. Our phone bill this year alone is going to be around $2 million for the phone bill. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So, but thank you guys for the free phone calls. That's $2 million in free. That's so. What we do with those phone calls, though, is those phone calls are all recorded. And those phone calls are a treasure trove, oftentimes, of intelligence on what criminal activities are going on. A number of times when I was at the DA's office, I can remember defense lawyers coming to me and saying at the very last minute on the eve of trial, they would say, the defendant's girlfriend, who is now an alibi witness, I didn't mention this before because we didn't know where she was, she's going to be coming in and testifying that her boyfriend on the night of the robbery was with her in another county, so he couldn't have, oh really, okay, all right. So what we would do with that normally is we would routinely call the jail and ask for the recording of the phone calls from the past week and have that, burnt to a CD. It started on, it used to be cassettes, and then they did CDs. And we'd come into court the next morning and, you would say, oh, let me give you this, counsel. And what is this? Well, these are the phone calls from the last week between the girlfriend and the bad guy. He would disappear for about 5 minutes. You'd see some chatter, and then you'd see a young lady hauling behind out of the courtroom as fast as she could What happened? I thought she was going to testify. Oh, she changed her mind. Only because, and you didn't even have to listen to them necessarily, but you knew there was a phone call between the two of them where they would concoct a story and say, oh yeah, now you're going to say that I was with you even though I was over there doing the robbery. So that's how we would deal with those. So, but those are the bad guys. You have to expect that, right? And the defense bar, they're only doing their job. I used to get mad about it sometimes, but I learned, you know what? I'm glad I'm not a defense lawyer. That's all I can say. So coming forward, or actually going backward, let's go back. Let's talk about the history of the office of the sheriff. Now, let me start this by saying the office of the sheriff, not just in Massachusetts. Now, the office of the sheriff in Massachusetts goes back to the year 1693. That's a long time. I would suggest here in Plymouth County it goes back a little further. Let's say 1620. And I would say that the person who is the professional ancestor of the sheriffs would be Miles Standish. Miles Standish was not one of the saints, as the Pilgrims called themselves. He was an outsider, but he was a military person by profession, and his job, he was essentially the first Secretary of Homeland Security with that original settlement in 1620, which I think is a little different than other places, and I'll tell you why. But anyway, going further back than that, the office of the sheriff is the oldest known governing institution to the Western world outside of a king or a queen. Now think about that for a minute. And the reason, or the way that the sheriff's office came to be, goes back to the 9th century in Great Britain, and actually in England, where a monarch by the name of Alfred the Great, he was great, for lack of a better word. But what he did, he realized that his kingdom was too large for him to adequately control without some help. So he decided what he was going to do was name somebody who could act as his agent in all things royal throughout the whole kingdom, and created what was called the reeve. Now, in medieval England, they didn't have counties like we know them. What they called, well, they did, but they didn't call them counties. They called them shires. So if people are familiar with the Tolkien novels, the British author, they talk about the shire. And sometimes we still see vestiges of that in some of the business names, the Shiretown Ford dealership or the Shiretown Glass Company. And what a shire town was and is any town within a county, within the shire, where a seat of government lies. So the shire, actually Plymouth has 2 shire towns. One is the town of Plymouth, because county government the seat is there. And the other would be the city of Brockton, because oftentimes some of those county functions are performed out of there. Now, county government back in those days was, actually up until fairly recently, and in some other places in the country, it's very active, and they do a lot of stuff. In Massachusetts, not so much. They do some things, but it's really largely a vestige. Even our agency back in 2010, 2011, we ended up transitioning from being a county agency over to being a state agency, and nothing really changed with one exception, and that was our funding source. We became line items in the state budget instead of being part of the county budget, and it's done us a world of good, but nowhere near enough good because they don't fund us adequately, but that's another story. So, the shire town. And what they did in the shires, or what Alfred the Great did, was he divided that up into things called tithings, or groups of 10. So they had different individuals who worked for the reeve, who worked for the king, and essentially they taxed, they were military commanders, they did everything. They were judges, they were the juries, they found fact, they were the executioners, you name it, they did it. And in some places here in the United States, the sheriffs still do a lot of those things. Like down in Louisiana, the sheriff is the tax collector. I'm glad I don't have to do that. Can you imagine having to collect taxes and then try and get reelected, right? That's tough. In a lot of places, the sheriff is the coroner. So anytime there is an unattended death, the sheriff has to go. And that doesn't mean that the sheriff is a medical doctor necessarily. Sometimes they are. But they have to be, or have someone on staff who can correctly identify if a death is natural or we need to be suspicious, you know? So I'm glad I don't have to do that. We have an office of the medical examiner and they're busy enough, right? So those duties, you know, they were military leaders. And it's funny to think, I've never done it, but maybe I will before I retire. I know the question is asked, when am I retiring? I get that question a lot lately. I don't know why. But at any rate, do you know that the sheriff can activate and call out the National Guard? Yeah, it's part of Chapter 37. That might be fun, right? I do remember once being here in Halifax. Chief, you'll appreciate this. I think Mike Manoogian was the chief at the time, but they were doing I think it was a Veterans Day or a Memorial Day parade. And they were gathering at the Walmart parking lot. And I remember going there, and I was so impressed because there were it was a military parade, and there were a lot of guys dressed up in World War II GI uniforms. But what was really, really cool to me was there were tanks. There were a number of them. I think there was a Chaffee tank, there was a Sherman tank, there was an armored half-track, all kinds of armored vehicles, World War II infantry. And it was so impressive to see all those guys in their uniforms driving the tanks down the street. It was really something. And I remember grabbing Chief Manoogian at the time and saying, you know, Chief, I don't want to give you any ideas. I said, but if we were ever going to do it, now is the time. While we've got an armored division and all these troops, I think we should invade Plimpton. He just looked at me and walked away. But it's funny. So that's the history in England. You know, the sheriffs did everything. And the sheriffs generally, I'd like to think that they were good guys, but just like kings or queens, they're not all good. And not all the sheriffs were good. In fact, perhaps a majority of them were not good back in those medieval times. How many people, you know, remember the novel and probably saw some of the movies, Robin Hood? You know, my favorite iteration of that is the Errol Flynn, the 1939 version. I love it. Basil Rathbone, Errol Flynn, yeah. Who is that? Olivia de Havilland is in that. But who is the bad guy in that? The sheriff of Nottingham, exactly. And the reason the sheriff was the bad guy was the king was the bad guy, King John, and that actually reflects history a little bit as well. As I mentioned, the Magna Carta, the English don't have a constitution the way that we do. What the English have, and we actually have it a little bit as well, it's our legacy from being British colonies, is English common law. So the rights of Englishmen come really from English common law, which is kind of an interesting thought. It's not necessarily codified as a constitution. And there was some debate back before the Constitution was drafted. Do we really need a constitution given the fact that we have a tradition of English common law? Well, we decided, thankfully, that we did. But in the year 1215, and again, you know, King Richard the Lion-Hearted was off in the Holy Land fighting the Crusades. King John, the bad guy, he came to power and was very, very abusive, not just to his subjects, but he was abusive to the noblemen, you know, so the dukes and the earls, they were really having a really rough time with this king, the way that he taxed them and demanded troops to be sent. It was really a bad thing. So they decided upon their own that they were going to rise up, the nobles, against the king and force him to sign this Magna Carta, which delineated, they would say the rights of Englishmen, but really what it was delineating were the protection and the rights for the nobles. So not exactly what we would call a Bill of Rights or anything like that, but it's interesting to note, in that document, which is one of the most significant documents in English history, and actually in world history too, there were 63 clauses in that which limited the power of the king. 27 of those 63 clauses dealt directly with the power and authority that the king had given to the sheriff. So what that tells me is that the kings, assisted by the sheriffs, were abusing everybody. So when you see in Robin Hood that the sheriff is the bad guy, That's probably not too far off. And that's how they did that. So coming forward, so we see it goes way, way back in English history, but there are those who say it goes back even further. And one of the things that I've taken the liberty of bringing with me today is a book, not just any book, it's the good book. Would it surprise you to know that the sheriffs are mentioned in the Bible? And not just the Bible, the Old Testament of the Bible, the book of Daniel. The Bible that I have brought with me is my favorite iteration of this book. It is the King James Version. And it's interesting to note, people say, well, why do you like the King James Version the way that you do? And what it is, it means something to me historically, because this is the translation that was done during the reign of King James in Great Britain. And this is the Bible that our founding fathers would have read from when they were formulating their ideas about the natural rights of men. So this is, I always look for the KJV, the King James Version. And really all it is differences in translation. Most times you'll go to churches, I think what they're going to have in the back of the pew, I always check, because I'm weird that way. But I always check, it's usually the New American Standard, which is just a different translation. So I'll read to you just a quick passage from the book of Daniel, chapter 3, verse 3. And what this is that portion of the Bible where King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, ancient Babylon, 2,000 plus years ago, had created a false idol of gold. So here we go. Then the princes, the governors and captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. That's the book of Daniel, chapter 3, verse 3. So the sheriffs apparently were in ancient Babylon 2,000 plus years ago. How many people believe that? Well, it's in the Bible, right? So it must be true. What it is, and I say this, I pull that out, and people are always very hesitant to question the authority as given forth in the good book. But what it is, it's the translation. So in the day of King James, when this translation was made from the ancient Aramaic into the present English, the sheriffs were essentially the governing authority for judicial matters, law enforcement, and military. So the sheriffs obviously are going to get mentioned. If you look at like the New American Standard or some of these other translations, the sheriffs are not in there. The word sheriff has been replaced with magistrates, which I don't know. I think I like it better with the sheriffs, but that's me. So I don't think that sheriffs necessarily existed in ancient Babylon as sheriffs, but there always was that authority. And it is interesting to note that this goes all the way back to medieval England and the sheriffs. If people have questions or want to chime in, please feel free to do so. I feel very much at home when I'm interrupted. I also, if you get up and walk away, I'm used to that at home too. So, but I wanted to hand out a couple of. These are the patches, the actual shoulder patches. Yeah. So this, like medieval times, this is another thing that really goes back to medieval times as well. You notice that the shoulder patch, and actually you guys have the Halifax one, it's in the form of a shield, right? And some shields are a little bit different. But you can see, you have that there, and you've got your sword in the other hand. So the heraldry, and people know about heraldry, we talk about how and what that was our way to identify friends and foes when we were on the battlefield, running around hacking at each other with swords, right? And shooting longbows. So this is a tradition that comes to us. And many people in their homes will have their family coat of arms, and those are always interesting to have. I know we have them at my house. And it's, for me, it's a little bit confusing because I am of Irish, Italian, and Portuguese descent, but I really only know our family crest as it came from Scotland. So when I have a lot of cousins in Ireland and I go to visit them routinely, they look at me as the Scotsman. And I don't know that I don't think I'm Scottish. I might be, I should check, but interesting to note. So what we would do is that's how you would identify who someone was who was a friend and somebody who was an enemy on the battlefield. So coming forward to today, every town and every agency is going to have their own heraldry. And I think it's important, and I talk about this in our academy, because this is one of those things that builds pride and builds an esprit de corps in your people. Take some pride in this, in the uniform. I say to my guys all the time, the uniform, it looks nice, but it's not what makes it special. What makes these uniforms special isn't the uniform or the style of it. What makes it special are the people that wear it and go out and do these great things. That's the pride. But what this represents, and I think you can imagine that ship in the middle there is the Mayflower, right? We go back to 1620. And around it are those circles that Chris referred to as scallops. And, before lunch, I'd like to think, yeah, they're scallops. But really what they are, if you look at the original county seal, it's a string of pearls. And if you see at the top there, the squiggly on the top is actually, back in olden days, they didn't have clasps necessarily. So if you had a string of pearls, someone would have to come behind you and tie that if you were going to wear it, and tie it into a nice bow that would be secure. So that is the bow. Those are the pearls. And if you count those pearls, there are 27 of them in the string. And that corresponds to, there are 27 communities in the county of Plymouth. We have 26 towns and the city of Brockton. So that's that. And I tell people, I kind of made this part up myself, but it sounds good. The knot that holds that string of pearls together is us. So I thought that was kind of neat. And that's the heraldry, and that's in the middle there, that's the county seal. I changed it a few years ago. It used to say Sheriff's Department. Now it just says Sheriff across the top, because technically we're not a department, we are an office, because the agency head is elected. So, and as was mentioned, I stand for election every 6 years. The DA stands for election every 4 years. So Tim likes to tease me. He says that when I got elected sheriff, the deal I got was buy two, get one free. So that's true. I'm not on the ballot till 2028. So like I said before, I'm here because I want to be, and I like to come out and I like to talk about these things because I find them interesting. I hope you do too. It's a very, very interesting job. People ask me all the time, what do you do? Every day is different. We meet once a month, the sheriffs do, and we discuss issues. I meet once a month with the chiefs of police as well, and I'm welcome there. That's great. Some of these things that I had talked about here. Now, the office of the sheriff, and in Plymouth County, I think we're a bit special, more so than other places. Not just because we live here, but if you ever go to Plymouth, you see there are great mottos a lot of times on cruisers and things like that. I know the sheriff in Worcester County, his says community committed. And I thought that was kind of cool, and then I thought about it. What does that mean, community committed? Does that mean he's got his whole community committed in the jail? I don't know. I hope not. But at any rate, if you've ever seen the Plymouth ones, I know in Los Angeles it's very, to protect and to serve. And those are great mottos, and I think mottos are another great way to build an esprit de corps. But in Plymouth, you see they have America's hometown. What does that mean, America's hometown? That doesn't mean that everyone lives here, or at one time lived here, but maybe it does. And what makes us a little bit special, I always used to, when I taught history, and I used to teach history at one of the local colleges, I would always, start out asking the students, what's the oldest settlement that you can think of in the New World, in North America? And, I'll ask that question here. How many people, what's the earliest settlement you can think of? Roanoke, perfect. That is so good. That's the 1597? In Roanoke, yeah. And that's a great story. If you've never read the story of the colony of Roanoke, they established it, left the colony, they went back to England to resupply, and then came back, only to find out that the colony had vanished, was gone. The buildings were there, but everything was gone. It's one of the great mysteries of history. There, every once in a while you see. So it's called the Lost Colony of Roanoke. 1597, that's an older. A lot of people say Jamestown. Jamestown is 1607, yep. Plymouth doesn't come around until 1620. But then a lot of people say, well, what about Spanish Mexico and Spanish Florida? The Spaniards were here before the English were, and that's true. When Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, he sailed under the flag of Spain. Columbus was an Italian, but he sailed for under the flag of Spain because they were the ones who financed his voyage. And the reason, Columbus wasn't coming to discover new lands. In fact, he didn't realize that he had until much later. He was looking for a shorter, quicker trade route to the Far East so that they could bring spices back, which were very expensive. Spices, silks, and fabrics, and luxury goods. They were looking for a fast way to do it. So instead of going that way, let's go that way. And what he ended up doing, he didn't realize that he wasn't in India, or as they called it, the Indies at the time. That's why, when he landed, the Taino people, I think, were the first ones that he saw in the Caribbean. He referred to them as what? As Indians, because he thought he was in the continent of India. He thought he was somewhere else. Really kind of a cool concept. And they didn't figure that out for a while, but what the Spanish were looking for was two things. They were looking for primarily gold. They wanted to enrich themselves, and they found a lot of that here. But they also sought to convert a lot of the native population to Catholicism. So, and their brand of colonialism was very brutal, not something necessarily to be proud of, because those that they couldn't convert, and many that they did convert, were actually killed at the hands of the Spaniards. What was interesting, not the jail, doesn't matter. So what was interesting, the other group that was busy colonizing the New World were the French, right? And the French we think of, they're up in Canada. And how many people have driven through Quebec and seen all those signs in French and heard all those people speaking French and wondered, geez, I wonder why that is. And that's because they were colonized by the French. Interesting, huh? Now, the French had what was probably the most benign form of colonialism, because they came here also to make money, but not so much in gold. They wanted to make money in furs. There was a great market for the fur trade in Europe. So they came, and the French generally mingled with the Indians and lived really pretty harmoniously with them. People might remember learning about the travels of Lewis and Clark in 1803, and the very famous Indian guide that he had. She was, I believe, Shoshone, Sacagawea, you've heard it pronounced? Yeah. How many of you guys have heard of her, right? And she really was the glue that kept that group together and got them all the way to the West Coast safely. When you think about the Lewis and Clark expedition, that was almost like, the missions to Mars that we have, because people didn't know what was past the Mississippi River. And once they got past there, they were on their own. So, but, Sacagawea, as the old, they pronounce her Sacagawea now. I don't know why, but that's what they do. Her husband, does anybody know what her husband's name was? Her husband was a bit of a jerk. Yeah. Her husband was a guy by the name of Toussaint Charbonneau. Now, can we guess Toussaint Charbonneau was a French guy? Yeah, and really not a nice person, but she was aces. She was great, so she got them safely to the West Coast. Only one person died on that entire trip. That was a captain a sergeant that they had, whose name escapes me. But they believe that his death was not at the hands of natives or anything like that. His death was a result of what they believe now to be appendicitis, which they didn't really, there was nothing they could have done. They didn't have the skills to perform that type of surgery. So, interesting to note. I'll think of his name before I leave. But So interesting. The French, so you had the Spanish colonialism, the French, and the English. Now the English, and especially here in Plymouth, let's come back to America's hometown. The reason that I say, and I agree with the fact that we are America's hometown and we're America's home county, is because so much of what would become essential to the founding of the United States took place either right here or within a few miles of right here. To me, that's really, really interesting stuff. So when you think about it, the English came, and when the Pilgrims landed in 1620, all legends about the Rock and other things notwithstanding, you know, they landed in Provincetown first and ended up making their way eventually to Plymouth. They tried to go further south, but they couldn't because of weather and shoals, and ended up coming back. But what they did, and I have to think that there was part fortuitous circumstances here, but I think they took advantage of this. Their charter, their royal charter that allowed them to come here, had them landing in Virginia. Now, Virginia was a lot bigger then than it is today. You know, certain West Virginia didn't exist. It was all just Virginia. Clearly, though, they were outside of the boundaries of where they had intended to be. So they took it upon themselves. And English colonialism, unlike the French, who intermarried and commingled, the English kept themselves very separated. They came here to set up their own English settlements. They didn't want to mix with them. They didn't want bad relations, but they would be perfectly happy without any relations of any kind. But they did end up needing the natives to survive, because believe it or not, the technology of the natives, although, you know, we think of them as primitive, their agricultural technologies were decades ahead of what the Pilgrims had in their English gardening, and they really needed them to, and that's why we have the first Thanksgiving and things like that. So yeah, that really, and there's a lot of truth to what the legend that you see. But think about that. You know, the Pilgrims came here, knew that they weren't where they were supposed to be, where the royal charter had set them up, and took it upon themselves. You know, they came here really seeking religious freedom, not making money. Jamestown and Roanoke, to a lesser degree, although Roanoke never stuck, Jamestown was a commercial venture. They went there to raise tobacco. And the idea was, we're going to come, we're going to make our fortune, and we're going to get the heck back to England so we can spend the money. They didn't want to stay. But the Pilgrims came here to stay. And they wanted to set up homes, and they wanted to set up a place where they could worship and enjoy freedom. So that is why they rightly call themselves, and Plymouth rightly calls itself, America's hometown. The very first thing that the Pilgrims did before disembarking, the Mayflower Compact, 1620. And that is the very first document of self-government in all of the New World. No one else thought of it. Why? Because they didn't need it. They weren't coming to set up a permanent settlement. They were perfectly happy to live under whatever laws they brought with them from England. But Plymouth was different. Do people agree with me, disagree with me? I don't know. That's my thoughts anyway, but I think we really can rightfully call ourselves. That's what makes us a little different. Now, going forward, you know, I say the office of the sheriff goes back to 1692, and that's true as an office of the sheriff. But if you look further back, as I said, Miles Standish in 1620, he was really the Homeland Security guy. So he was, I would submit, the first sheriff. So I think here in Plymouth County, we lay claim. What makes 1692 an operative? What happened in 1692 is that the Massachusetts Bay Colony combined with the Plymouth Colony to become the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the bigger version. So you oftentimes hear reference to the old colony, right? How many people have heard the old colony elder services, or the old, you know, the old colony Boy Scout Council, you see that a lot, right? And the reason, and it's funny to think about it, we don't give it a second thought today, but old colony anything goes back to 1692, and actually before then, when you had the Massachusetts Bay Colony in Boston and points north, and the old colony, which was us. So when they merged, how did they refer? Well, where do you come from, sir? Oh, I come from Weymouth in the old colony. You know, that's how they would have thought of that stuff. So it's interesting to think, but we were and are the old colony. I think it's kind of cool. Yeah. So are there any questions that people have up to this point? Yes, sir.
They go to prison in the other night on TV. I think it was in Suffolk. Is it Suffolk County? Is there?
There is a Suffolk County, yes.
That jail. They're teaching these criminals how to be good. Tell me, what the hell do you teach a criminal to be good? Police officer, do they know how to teach somebody to be good?
Well, with all due respect, no, their job isn't to teach people how to be good. Their job is to protect the good people like you guys from those people that have to come to me to hopefully learn to be good. And that's one of the, that's something I should probably talk about, because you see it a lot and you see these things thrown around a lot. Let me just close this out very quickly by saying that, the office of the sheriff existed in colonial days. The office of the sheriff is memorialized in the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Here in the United States, we don't rely upon common law, although we do have common law from England. But what we do is we have constitutions and statutes and laws. That's how we do those things. So the sheriffs are actually mentioned 2 times. The Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which dates to 1780, is the oldest constitution in the world still governing anywhere. The Constitution of the United States dates to 1787 when it was drafted and 1789 when it was passed, or finally ratified, I should say. So our Constitution was actually predating the federal Constitution and actually served as the model for the federal Constitution. Interesting to note. But in that Constitution, the sheriffs are actually mentioned in 2 places. One place, people ask me how we go back to medieval England. Article 9 of that Constitution of 1780 lists the oath that is to be administered to the sheriffs and other officials, but to the sheriffs. So the reason, and I had this conversation with somebody, we weren't created by the Constitution, because when the Constitution was created, we'd existed for 1,000 years. We were there. And then the other place that we're mentioned in the Constitution is Article 19, which dates to 1855, when the office of the sheriff, because the king had appointed the sheriff up to that point, when here in the New World the colonies existed, it was the royal governor on behalf of the king that appointed the sheriff. And then in early colonial days, after independence, it was the governors who appointed the sheriff. And in 1855, someone had the good idea to say, you know what? This is America. We don't appoint people. Kings don't appoint people. We elect people. And they made the office elective. And that's how it's been since that time. So every 6 years, I stand for election. Every 4 years, the DA does. And you have a say. And I think that's important. I know there's a movement afoot now to say, well, the sheriff should be appointed. Whenever anybody gives you the option, oh, no, you don't have to vote for this. We got this for you. We'll make that decision. I don't trust you to make a decision as to who the sheriff ought to be. I always go against that, because the power of your vote is the most important power that we have. Although very few people exercise it, but we do, right? We do. So coming back to your question about, or your commentary about why are we teaching them skills, the hope is, and this is a hopeful profession, and I like to, there's not many places in law enforcement where you can say, yeah, we're hopeful. But we are. And what we do at the sheriff's office is we run what's called the House of Correction and a jail. And there's a difference between a house of correction and a jail. A jail is technically where people are held prior to being convicted. So they haven't been convicted yet. That's a jail. In our place, some places they're different, like it's separate places. In our place, they're in the same building. The oldest jail in the country that's still in use is in Bristol County, and that is the Ash Street Jail. And it's interesting to note, they date probably to the early 19th century, 1840s. how many people remember or have heard of, I'm sure you have, the case of Lizzie Borden? You know, Lizzie Borden, that was a famous homicide down there. She was held at the Ash Street Jail, which is still holding bad guys today. The Ash Street Jail, yeah. Just for the record, though, Lizzie Borden was acquitted. They think it was one of the uncles that actually did it, but who knows? We can discuss that another time. But so it's interesting. So a jail is pretrial, and a house of correction. Now, who goes to the house of correction? That's a great question, and people don't necessarily know that. In its name, the idea is they're coming to us for correction. We're going to give them a skill set. The reason we want to do that is because if you have a guy who was knocking over convenience stores before he got there, or, you know, beating people up before he got there, we want to give him an opportunity. Doesn't mean he's going to take it, and oftentimes they don't, but give him a skill set and give him an opportunity to get a legitimate job on the outside and maybe do something constructive. And I can't tell you, one of the things, it's very satisfying to me when you see somebody who gets his GED, you know, because a lot of these guys are high school dropouts, somebody to get some credits that they can apply to a college when they get out, or even better, one of the things we're looking into now, COVID derailed us for a little bit, but we were trying to get people who, if their record was not too bad, they could qualify to be in the laborers union or to learn how to do plumbing or electrical work. And it's amazing the epiphany that takes place. You see that light bulb go off over someone's head when they realize, I can make more money as an electrician or a plumber than I ever could as a drug dealer. And it's true, and they don't have those worries about looking over their shoulder all the time to have the police chasing them at any level. So the reason we do those things isn't because we want to coddle people or we want to make it fun. It's because we want to give them a legitimate opportunity to do the right thing. Having said that, not everybody does the right thing, even with those skills. But, you know, it's not because we're not trying to do those things. That's important to us. Any questions or comments about that? No? Yeah?
Well, if a person goes to jail and did something that caused a sentence or something, to me, if I was a judge, which I'm not, of course, like to be, but anyway, if you're going to go to jail for so many years, to me, you should serve your time, your crime first. Well, don't worry about making him a good guy. Let's make him serve his time for what he did. You know, put him in the cell, let him sit there for 4 or 5 years, whatever. Let him think about it. Maybe he'll make himself good himself.
Yeah.
That's what I say. I don't understand how the system can make a guy like that
Some people are.
good again.
Yeah.
He'll never be good. He'll do something as soon as he gets out on the steps.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's funny that you express it that way. And there's some folks that agree with you. And I'm not going to say I don't always disagree with that sentiment in some instances. And the history, when I teach a much deeper dive on the history of corrections with our officers. And there were many brilliant philosophers who expressed exactly your sentiment. Think about, you know, the word penitentiary. You know, we all know what a penitentiary is, but what is at the root word of penitentiary is penance. Yes, exactly right. And there were those who believed, William Penn, the famous founder of the colony of Pennsylvania, was a Quaker, and the Quakers were noted for their goodness and their honesty. That's why when you buy Quaker oats, you know, and it's you don't think about it, it's funny. But the reason that they have the picture of the Quaker on there is Quakers were noted in those olden times for their honesty and their integrity. So you knew if I bought the oatmeal from the Quaker guy, it's going to be good, right? And that's why it's funny to think about these things, but they go so far back in time and we have no idea necessarily. So what you guys are expressing here is exactly the discussion that the most brilliant philosophers of their time had at that time. So I commend you guys for that. You know, you've got your opinions, and, you know, who am I to say that you're not right about these things? Yeah. Well, you're right. There has to, you know, there's usually, what's the old saying? You know, I've got this side, that side, and the right side. Yeah, there's something in the middle. And, you know, for those incorrigibles, let's call them, and those are the ones I think you're referring to. If those guys are going to continue to be bad actors, I have no problem seeing them taken off the streets, and if we never see them again, that's a good thing. I don't disagree with you there. But I think, you know, part of our job in corrections is to make those corrections. Now, having said that, there are many people that suffer from character flaws that I think will render it, you can't turn a bad guy into a good guy. What you can do, though, is give a bad guy new skills that make it more profitable for him to be a good guy, right? So let's work with his human nature to make those changes. So the question then becomes, you know, who goes to the House of Correction and who goes to a state prison? And oftentimes you will see that whenever you see like the House of Correction in Billerica, or the House of Correction in Ludlow, or the House of Correction in Plymouth, that's a county level facility. And the inmates that come to us at that county level are inmates who are convicted, or, well, first off, the jail part, which is with all of us as well. The jail part is for pretrial, people who are held on bail or held without bail, but people who are sentenced to the House of Correction can be held on either a felony or a misdemeanor, as long as that sentence that they've been sentenced to is 2.5 years or less, okay? Now, what's the difference? You hear these terms all the time, a felony and a misdemeanor. The difference between the felony and the misdemeanor in a general sense is a felony is more serious than a misdemeanor. Misdemeanor is simply another way of saying a misdeed, misdemeanor. And a felony, as I said, more serious. When you look at a statute, if you want to see if that is a felony or a misdemeanor, what you do is at the end of those statutes, when you read the Mass General Laws, it'll give the penalties at the end of, it'll define what the crime is, tell you what the elements of that crime are, but then it will tell you what the punishment potentially is. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to get that full punishment, because it's up to the judge. Now, if you were the judge, I suspect they'd probably get the full punishment. But what happens is, someone like the crime, let's talk about a crime that everyone can visualize, an assault and battery, right? So an assault and battery is when someone goes over and it's an unconsented touching, or in most cases, a hit of some kind, to another person. They didn't consent to that. That was a bad thing to do. It was a misdeed, and it was a misdemeanor. So what that will allow for is a certain penalty not to exceed 2.5 years in the House of Correction. However, if I do it with a weapon, if I hit you with a book, and a weapon can be many, many things that you don't necessarily think about, but let's say there's a weapon involved, so now it's not an assault and battery, it's an assault and battery by means of a dangerous weapon. Now it's a felony. And if you look at the penalty part, it's going to provide for a lengthier than 2.5 year sentence in a state prison. So now you know, if it only provides House of Correction, it's a misdemeanor. If it does provide for a prison sentence, that's a felony. And that's how you tell whether it's a felony or a misdemeanor. And as I said, it's all up to the judge. Someone comes before the judge, even on a felony. I've seen it all the time. The case will be continued without a finding, or someone will be put on probation. The fact of the matter is today, and I know you don't like this necessarily, but if you started committing crimes today, I'm going to say, you know, short of going out and committing a homicide of some kind, it's going to take you 8 or 10 years before you see the inside of a correctional facility. That's just the reality of it. You're going to get pretrial probation. You're going to get court costs. You're going to get continue without a finding. You're going to get straight probation. You're going to get straight probation with a suspended sentence. You're going to get a split sentence. And then ultimately you'll end up with a jail sentence. So you have really, you know, a lot of people live their lives, and they're generally great people, under the impression, geez, if I commit a crime and these guys arrest me, I'm going to jail. No, very unlikely, despite our best efforts sometimes, by the police, by the DAs. It really takes some effort for you to get to us. But once you get to us, you know, we're going to provide you with a safe place to be. We're going to give you training. We're going to give you education. And we're hopefully going to give you a better alternative when you get out. Because the one thing that we all remember, or should remember, is 99% of the people that come in through the side door are going to be walking out after a while through the front door. And I have to do the best that I can to make sure when they come back into the community that they're not going to do the bad things that they did before, or new bad things. So that's what I got. Any? Yes, please.
The others could come. That question is, what is the reason that they move prisoners from one penitentiary or wherever to another one? I noticed that on TV they kept mentioning that some of these prisoners, they move them down south to a prison or they go out west.
Okay.
What is the reason they move certain people one to the other?
Sure. Now, the question that he asks, I think, has to do more with the detainees that we're talking about right now than prisoners. But let me answer the question with reference to prisoners. We, all the time, will separate prisoners from other prisoners for safety reasons. But then sometimes, during a pretrial situation, you might have members of, let's say, a motorcycle gang committing crimes. And I'm saying this because we have a situation now where this stuff is going on. So they're all members of a motorcycle gang that's committing crimes. So rather than housing them together and giving them an opportunity to cook up a story together, we're going to take, out of 6 of them, we're going to take 2 of them, put them in Franklin County, 2 of them, put them in Hampden County. We're going to stick 1 over on the Vineyard. We're going to put a couple up in Essex County. So you split them up, and they're not able to concoct or contrive a story together. So we're able to, on the prosecution side, and the police can go and interview them at their convenience. And, you know, obviously you're going to get 6 different guys. You'll probably get 6 different stories. And as you say, the truth is nowhere to be found. But we often get to the bottom of that. So, but what I think your question is, and you're reacting to some of the stories you're seeing on the news right now. Is that what you're talking? Yeah. So Plymouth County is unique in the sense that we have contracts, and we have always had contracts since before the construction of the new jail from 1994. We hold on behalf of the United States Marshal Service. So any person that's accused of federal crimes and held on bail is coming to us. That's why we held Whitey Bulger for that period of time. You know, a lot of people say, well, geez, he was a federal prisoner. Why was he with you? Well, all of the federal prisoners essentially go to us. And I think that's a credit to the men and women that work down there. They really do such a good job, and it's so secure that they trust us with those individuals. How many people, I'm very glad to say that if you're traveling now, you no longer have to remove your shoes at the TSA checkpoints. Yep. If you think back a few years, you remember the guy responsible for us having to do that was a guy by the name of Richard Reed. He had bombs in his shoes. He was trying to ignite them, and luckily he was unsuccessful, but he was held at Plymouth on behalf of the feds. So it's, that always happens. So we do hold for the marshals, but we also hold for ICE, for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And what makes that interesting now is because we have got a capacity of about 525 with reference to ICE in particular. And if they exceed that, we can't take them. We're the only facility in Massachusetts that does hold for ICE. So anytime they're bringing in a new crew, they oftentimes will take the older crew and move them for space purposes to other places in other states. And that's why they do that. It's a practical matter of us being able to have the physical space to humanely hold that number of people. So sometimes, too, you want to protect somebody. You have somebody, like, one of the concerns with Whitey Bulger was there's a lot of bad guys that wanted him dead, too, so we have to be. And how long did he last in federal custody? He lasted with us for 3 or 4 years, but, yeah, he was evil, no question. Some people asked me, what was he like? You know what I say? I don't know. Well, didn't you go and talk to him? No. Why would I do that? I had nothing to say to that guy because, as you say, I believe he was evil. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions people want to share? Yeah.
Why would somebody get more time depending on the way they tried to kill somebody? My sister was stabbed about 8 years ago in Pembroke.
Mm.
Almost died, and he didn't get as much time because it was stabbing rather than like shooting
Mhm.
or whatever.
Yeah. That's a good question, and to a layperson, it might appear as though there is a difference, like the means by which you kill someone or attempt to kill them. But the law itself does not really differentiate. So if I were to shoot you with a gun, or stab you with a knife, or try to run you over with a car, or any of those things, the potential penalty would be the same. What would happen, though, is that in certain circumstances, let's, God forbid, they're successful in their attempt to kill somebody, there are enhancements based upon, certain depraved heart things will take a murder and make it second degree, but now move it up to first degree. When those, you're talking about degrees of homicide and the degrees of and when you're talking about homicides, it can be very complicated because you can have involuntary manslaughter, voluntary manslaughter, second degree murder, first, and there are specific definitions, and the penalty does differ a little bit, but not so much based upon the means by which you attempt to do that. Some things too, like there's a theory of murder, the felony murder rule. You don't necessarily intend to kill anybody, but you're out, you're driving the getaway car, and I'm inside robbing the convenience store. And unbeknownst to you, I'm in the convenience store, I shoot somebody. I get into the car, you and I take off. You have no idea I killed anybody.
Right.
But the law is going to hold you accountable for the homicide that I committed because the felony murder, well, first off, joint venture, we worked together. And secondly, this murder took place, or this death took place during the course of the commission of a felony. So now that elevates it. No matter what the circumstance was, we were committing a felony when that person died, and there's an enhancement there that makes that a murder. It's felony murder. So that can happen too. Certain things too, like what they call the depraved heart. And that's exactly what it sounds like. You've got some guy walking down the street with a gun. He walks by a nightclub and says, geez, I don't know anybody in there, but I think I'll fire into the windows. And someone gets, he didn't necessarily know that person or intend to kill that person, but the actions were those of a depraved person who knew or should have known that that conduct would result in somebody's death. So that can be a murder as well. So what the question you ask is a good one, because to an outside person, geez, number one, how did they charge it? Number two, how did the jury come back? Because what we charge and what the jury comes back with, we don't have control over necessarily. And then the other variable that's there, as is mentioned, the judge. The judge has a range usually of penalties that the judge can impose. And it's going to be up to that judge to assess the seriousness of the conduct, the seriousness of the injuries to people that were the victims here. And the judge is theoretically the person who is going to come up with what is just in that particular instance. And unfortunately for us, the family of the victims, oftentimes, there is no justice. How do you make justice for a lost loved one? And I suggest you can't. There's no replacing. Yeah, no, but put yourself, put yourself in the position of, someone who lost somebody, and thank God it's never happened to me, but I can imagine what that would feel like. And there's nothing that can replace that person. Yeah. But that, yeah.
Thanks to a Halifax cop that happened to see her pull over, and she looked like she was in duress.
Wow.
And she was mentalized.
Yeah. Yeah. The world has always been a dangerous place, but it seems like more so now. Some of these films that you're seeing, I don't know if people saw, I can't remember where it was, but that Ukrainian woman who was seeking asylum, she's out of the blue. She sits down in a subway seat, and some guy behind her just gets up out of the blue and just stabs her right in the neck. And, and that professor at Auburn University, she's out jogging with her dog like she did every day, and a guy just comes out and kills her. So it's scary stuff. Yeah, it really is. So, anybody else? I guess so. Well, if anybody I have a few of these. If people want them, you're certainly welcome. Yeah. All right. Well.
Thank you.
You were all very polite. I appreciate it. I hope it was interesting.